I was 14 years old when I realized that my species needed me. I had normal life as a child. I wanted to do what every child does, play, pretend that the world doesn't have problems, lose myself in my imagination. And I remember as a child not wanting to grow up. Because when I looked at the adults in my life, my parents, teachers, strangers in the street, I saw this deep worry in their faces, and I couldn't fathom what were they worrying about. Why weren't they enjoying life? And as a child, I realized now I was really, really sheltered, and I'll tell you what happened to shatter that. I was 14 years old. I was a ninth grader in school, and for some reason, the topic of Hiroshima came up, Nagasaki, nuclear weapons. And what really blew my mind was that this was the first time I came across the knowledge of the existence of nuclear weapons. And it hit me so hard that I really still haven't recovered. My whole worldview was shattered, because here clearly was the most important thing in my entire life, the existence of these weapons that could destroy me and the whole world in minutes. And yet no one had told me about this for 14 years. No one had bothered to think that this was something that I should know. And it was at that point, as that 14-year-old child, back at home from school, going into the woods thinking, how is this possible? How can the smartest species in the history of life be so stupid? How is it possible that we could stockpile 50,000 nuclear weapons and have them pointed, ready at each other to blow up the world? In the rest of my life since then, the third of a century that has passed since that time, I've been trying to understand how this is possible. And my whole intellectual research and development in history has been designed to kind of unravel that mystery. So what I'm trying to do is make sense of nonsense, right? Because it's completely nonsensical that a species would create the means of its own destruction. And so I had to go back in time to understand how this happened. I realized very early on that I wasn't going to understand our predicament just by seeing the world today. Obviously, there was a long history, a long evolution of how these weapons came into being. And so I proceeded from that point on, leaving my childhood behind, to try to understand, to try to make sense of this nonsensical phenomenon, this incredible, dangerous situation we were in. For those of us who were born later than that, for those of us who were come of age after the 80s, it may be hard to understand. But during the 1980s, it seemed like we were on the edge. And later in the 80s, I remember about half the people in school and college really didn't think that the world would last very much longer. It was a very scary time. And yet something had changed, because as I looked into the history of nuclear weapons and nuclear war and militarization and power politics and the nation-state system and all these interrelated phenomena, I realized that denial hadn't always been there. Back in the 50s, all the children knew about nuclear weapons, right? They had to do exercises, duck and cover. So what had happened? Why did that knowledge disappear? And so I became really interested in how do societies determine what kind of knowledge is allowed to be taught to children? How do cultures decide who is able to understand what's happening? And so as a 14-year-old boy, sitting in the woods trying to make sense of this, I realized that I had been stripped of all trust for society. Because if society couldn't tell me the single most important thing relevant to my life, what could I trust them with? And so I decided I had to figure this out on my own. And as I said, the rest of my life has been an effort to try to make sense. So I'll try to explain it to you as best as I can after a third of a century of thinking deeply, studying this deeply. So we have to go way back in time. We actually have to go back in time hundreds of millions of years if we want to understand nuclear war. Not just the Cold War, not just the modern world, but hundreds of millions of years. And I realized that the single most important concept to understanding our crisis that we face as a species today is the notion of power. Power, I think, can explain more than any other concept in all the social sciences. And as I've thought about power, and as I've studied power, as I've explored different historical societies, different animal societies, I've come to understand power as forming a trinity. There are three fundamental types of power. The first, which we can call power one, is power as transformation. And every organism on this planet has to transform its environment, right? We can think of it very simply with beavers. Beavers come into a forest, they want to make a home, they proceed to check out the environment, to find out where they're going to build their dam, they proceed to cut trees down, to use mud and sticks to build a dam, and they completely transform their environment to find life, to find food, to find opportunities for safety. And the same is true from every organism. A bacteria will transform its environment. So power is not something we should demonize. Power is an inevitable byproduct of life, right? And power one, the capacity to transform nature, is fundamental to all life, right? So no problems there. Without power one, we'd all be dead. But power two, this is when difficulties came into evolution. Power two is about control and domination, exploitation. Power two, a simple example would be a parasite, a virus that wants to use you to reproduce itself. A predator, an animal that wants to eat you in order to feed itself. So power two now takes on a combative, an aggressive, a confrontational approach to reality. Power two organisms will use and exploit other organisms for their benefit. And this is very important to understand if we want to understand where we are today in the world. Now, of course, evolution will respond when a challenge is faced. And as these power two organisms emerged, we can think way back to the predator-prey interactions that we see in the fossil record after the Cambrian explosion about 500 million years ago. We see the evolution of sharp teeth, of weapons in fish. We also see the evolution of defense mechanisms, of resistance, and that is power three. Power three is resistance. As soon as you have power two, the desire and need to control another, you have power three, the desire and need to resist that control. So an example of power three would be our immune system. Our immune system evolved in order to protect us from any source of power two agency that seeks to control us. Likewise, any self-defense, the fight or flight scenario, those are all forms of power three. Power three also includes slave uprisings, like in Haiti in the late 1700s, when the slaves had had enough of their masters. So ever since power two and power three have evolved, they've had this dialectical relationship. You see this in co-evolutionary arms races. Cheetahs get faster in order to catch the Thompson's gazelle, power two. The Thompson's gazelle gets faster in order to escape the cheetah, power three. And these 1, 2, 3 of power also apply very strongly to human societies. One thing people are very unaware of on a general basis is that humans for a long time were fundamentally a power three species. Our ancestors, the hunter-gatherers, had figured out a way to prevent powerful alpha males from controlling the society. If we look at our close relatives, the chimpanzees, their society is completely controlled by power two individuals. The alpha male is a tyrant over the group. He will use violence. He will use murder if necessary to get his way. And yet, the other chimps resist as best as they can. But they're not that good at it, and so they live in a tyranny. If we look at our ancient ancestors, the hunter-gatherers, they were able to stop that alpha male logistics, the alpha male trying to control the society, and they did this in a very clever way. First, they gossiped about individuals that wanted to lord over them. If that didn't work, they ostracized them. If that didn't work, they sometimes executed them. And for tens of thousands of years, human societies managed to survive without leadership, managed to survive without inequality, managed to survive without living in fear of the tyrant. And then something fundamentally changed. Civilization occurred. Due to the overkill that our ancestors created by their incredible hunting technologies, we decimated lots and lots of big mammals. And suddenly there wasn't enough meat to go around, and our ancestors were forced to settle down and grow food. And as soon as we settled down and grew food, we were able to live in larger numbers. And as those numbers got bigger and bigger, small villages evolved into cities. Cities evolved into empires. And power to logistics came back to the fore. The alpha male mentality once again rose from the ashes and took over society. And here we are 10,000 years later in this situation fundamentally unchanged in the last 10,000 years, where certain individuals have a lot more power than others. And those individuals want to do what power to individuals also always want to do, and that is maximize their own well-being, maximize their power. Of course, it's a much more complicated story. There's other things besides power going on. One of the other things that we need to focus on is technology, right? Now, a chimpanzee male has limited destructive capabilities. He can destroy a very small amount of other chimps and so on. But if you look at the world today, there's more than a handful of individuals who have the power to destroy all of us, because it doesn't take that many weapons to destroy all of us anymore. And so as societies evolved, because of the nature of human societies have always had to compete against other societies for territories, for resources. And we've developed these ethical systems that enable us to see the other as fundamentally different than us, and to treat the other in a fundamentally different way than we treat fellow members of our group. And we come into this with a very long history. So here we are now with nearly 200 separate nation states on the planet, many of them armed to the teeth, the vast majority of them not trusting each other, and the overwhelming majority of humanity checked out, not paying attention, distracted, and really, really feeling helpless. What can we do to change the world? How can we help our species? Well, I have some proposals. The single most important thing we can do is, of course, to free our minds and our hearts. But how do we do that? Because if you look at the world carefully, you see that we become conditioned even before we are born. The conditioning starts in utero, and after we're born, the conditioning continues on and on and on. So how do we uncondition ourselves? Well, the best way is to actually study how we're conditioned, to see how we're programmed. If we can understand, if we can see how we are programmed, we have a chance to unprogram ourselves. So what I'm talking about is power 3 species survival probabilities, right? How can we maximize the chance that our descendants will be here in 1,000 years? Well, the first thing we have to do is we have to get a control of history. History is like a runaway train heading for a cliff. And most of us passengers are looking out the window, looking at the scenery. How do we change that? Well, we have to educate ourselves. We have to educate each other. We also have to look back in time to understand evolution. We have to see that the future comes from the past, and the past is a bloody past. Now, we could feel helpless. We could stop and just give up, but that won't stop the train. The only way this train will stop is if enough of us pull on the brakes. And the only way that'll happen is if enough of us see how the train's careening out of control. So I want to challenge you to think really, really deeply about your species. We are told to love our families. We are told to love our nation. We are told to love our so-called race. But in reality, your country doesn't need you. Your family doesn't need you. Your species needs you. I'm calling on you to identify first and foremost as Homo sapiens. Now, Homo sapiens means the wise ones, right? We are meant to be the wise species. So how is it possible that these mistakes are happening? Well, once again, we have to go back in time. Now, after you look at history, you'll realize that there are a lot of opportunities for change. Social change can happen extremely drastically, extremely fast. So don't give up hope. Remember that chaos is on our side. Chaos will come and will change the contours of reality if we have trust. We cannot surrender to the current situation. So just as you have children, as you see other people, share with them your truth. Share with them the hope that humanity will survive into a future where we can be free, prosperous, happy. Surrendering to evil, surrendering to helplessness, surrendering to ignorance is really not an option anymore. We have no alternative but to move forward and transcend, as all humans have transcended the past. But now we are called upon to transcend the past in a much more revolutionary way than has ever been possible. Is it possible? Yes, it is. Because once again, the future is unknown. I call upon you to think very deeply, to open your hearts to the suffering of others, to see that deep down we are so interconnected, all of us. I want you to think very deeply about your place in this universe, your place on this earth. Why are you here? Are you here just to have a good time? Are you here to help your species? Are you here to have hope for the humanity? I want you to know that in the end, of course, we will all die, but what we leave behind will survive for a little bit longer. So have faith in yourselves, have faith in each other, and trust that humanity will come together to solve these problems because we have no choice. Thank you.